Hi, good evening, everyone. This is Diane Lapis from the Beacon Historical Society. I'm the president, and I'd like to welcome you to our digital program. Our program this tonight is called New Research and Listening to Native America in 2021. Our guest speaker is Harv Hilovitz, who, as a young child, had a keen interest in Native peoples and culture. He holds an anthropology and archaeology degree and is a researcher at the Mount Julian Historic Site. He's had an opportunity to participate in a number of digs in the Hudson Valley and is involved in a number of Native American organizations. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Harv, who's going to present the program. So Harv, I'm going to share the screen and get the PowerPoint started.
Thank you.
There we go. Okay, you're on your own. There you go, Harv.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this talk this evening about some new research into Native America and about listening to Native people today. I think it's an interesting topic and an important topic. And there's a lot going on in Indian country that people should know about, I think. When I was asked to do a talk for the Beacon Historical Society, the original question to me was to do a talk about the local Native people. And I thought that was great, but I wanted to broaden the presentation to what I think is really relevant today. And that is where we're at with Native America and some new research going on in the Native American world, and also to listen to Native people. So that's what the talk is going to be about. And first, again, I'd like to thank Diane Lapis, who's the president of the Beacon Historical Society, who just introduced me. I wanted to thank Lorraine Harton Gilardi, who works with the Beacon Historic Society. Also wanted to thank the executive director of Mount Julian Historic Site in Beacon, Elaine Hayes. And I've been working with her for many years as a consultant to Mount Julian. And also wanted to give a shout out to my colleagues over at the Hudson River Maritime Museum, where I do some research for them. This presentation is going to be something like a survey class that you may have taken in college, where I'm going to touch upon a number of different topics and themes and hopefully tie them together in a coherent way so that you'll be able to enjoy the talk. There's really a lot going on in the indigenous world, and I think that more people outside of Indian country need to know about it. Diane, I have to digress for a second. I have this bar right across the screen where it says this meeting is being recorded. Is there any way that I can zap that? Or maybe I just have to hit continue?
Hit continue.
Okay. That was it. So the presentation tonight is really going to focus on, have three parts. The first is, how did we get here historically with Native America and in Indian country? It's a historic overview of where we're at now. Second part is about recent research having to do with Native America and the indigenous world. And a lot of that is relevant because nowadays scientists, anthropologists, archaeologists are working with Native people, local Native people, to wherever the area is that they're studying. And that is really helpful so that the scientific information is informed by the Native people. who are the target, the focus of the excavation or the research and the interpretation. So it's very helpful to have Native people on hand, and they're being trained all over the world, indigenous people, Native American people, to work alongside of the scientists, and that's really helpful. And the third part of the presentation is about listening to Native America and what some of their issues are today. So Diane, if you could go to the next slide. Okay. And just for full transparency, which is certainly important, I'm a non-native, but I've always been interested in Native American issues, went to college, studied about them, and I've been involved in some causes, quote unquote causes, relative to Native America in the country nowadays. So I pay a lot of attention to the legal issues surrounding Native America and what's going on nowadays. I pay attention to the Native media, of which there is one and a growing one. And I have some connections with Native scholars and some organizations. But I represent nobody but myself in terms of this presentation. So I want to make that clear. So just to begin, there's really a renaissance going on in the indigenous world today. Indigenous people have always been here, but they have been pushed to the sidelines. They've been marginalized, and despite all the erasure, despite all the colonialism and all the horrors that they've had to endure everywhere, they're finding their voices. They're demanding recognition. They're demanding their civil rights. They're demanding respect. And they're undergoing cultural revival in their own communities. And this is really a good time for them. And that's why I'm saying it's sort of a renaissance for Native people. And this is true of Native Americans in the USA. It's true of the First Nations people in Canada. It's true of the Aboriginal people in Australia, the Maori in New Zealand, South Sea Islanders, Hawaiians, throughout Central and South America, all over the world. It's really a movement, and everyone should be aware of it. And in fact, indigenous people have a seat in the United Nations, and there's also a number of NGOs that are indigenous NGOs and councils, really just for them. So if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to welcome everybody to where we are locally. We are in Lenapehoking. And Lenapehoking is the lands of the Lenape Delaware people, who are the original inhabitants of our region. And like it says in the slide, the word Lenape loosely translates to the real people, the original men, and that kind of a thing in the Lenape dialects. And you can see on that slide there are three different green colors that represent what the European people and the Euro linguists have considered that there are three different Lenape dialects, the northern, the central, and the southern. And, you know, I'll leave it at that. And we're going to talk more about the Lenape people who were the original people who lived right here where the Beacon Historical Society is, Mount Julian, where I am just outside of Kingston, New York, and, you know, etc. So if we could have the next slide. And thank you, Diane. It's just a beautiful photo I found online, and there's a renaissance, a renewal in Indian country, and that's the term that Native Americans use for themselves. At one point, there was pejorative saying Indian country, but nowadays it's a term that they're comfortable with, and they use it, inside their own communities. So it's an acceptable phrase if it's used respectfully. Okay, next slide. And again, it's part of the ongoing spiritual and cultural rebirth of indigenous people worldwide. And it's great to be a part of it and to be, on Turtle Island, on the earth at this time of this renaissance. There are a lot of negative things going on in the world, but this is one of the real positive things. Their voices are being heard again, and their energy is being infused into the rest of the global community. And that's what they want. They want a seat at the table again. They want to reverse the attempted erasure that has happened to them. And it's a real positive thing for everybody to share in, and it's really a positive time for them, despite all of the current issues that are going on. Okay, next. If you could do the next slide, thank you. And this is a photo of modern Native Americans. I mean, the point is that thankfully they are still with us. They have not been eradicated. They have not been, God forbid, made extinct. They are with us. They're part of us. The ones who live here are the first Americans, and they're citizens, and they want to be respected. They want to be heard. And tonight's presentation is my little way of trying to participate in that and contribute to that. Okay, so the next slide. And so the question is going to be, for the first part of the talk is, how did we get here in 2021? What's the background? What's going on? Well, we know from archaeology that Native people, Native Americans, have lived here for over 14,000 years. Let that sink in a second. 14,000 years they've been here. I mean, the United States of America is only 240 some odd years old. So they've been here 14,000 years. And that's the archaeological record. The Native people themselves talk about the great antiquity of their presence here and the presence of their ancestors. And that's not just some kind of New Age spiritual concept about their ancestors. Their ancestors, in their way of thinking, in their cosmology, the ancestors are still here with us and are still present. And the ancestors are present today, here. The natural formations, the living waters, the plants, the animal cousins of ours, the land itself is a presence, an ancient and continuous presence. The local names of all of the place names, the localities, the streams, the mountains, the rivers, so many places around here have native names. I think it was like 15 states have Native American names, if not more. And on top of all of that, there's also the continuous presence of the people themselves, the population, in numbers. And they're still living here with us. Some of them live out west, the Lenape, Delaware people. Some of them live in the area, and their descendants live here with us. And we need to be aware of that presence, and they're asking us to be aware of that presence. That's a very important part of listening. So that being said, how did it happen that there's been all of this loss, this tremendous loss of this, amazing indigenous multiculture across North and South America? Well, since 1492, there's been a long decline of native presence in the Americas. And recent demographers have said that at one point they estimate there were over 60 million indigenous people living in the Americas, like in 1491. 60 million. And that within, a couple of generations of 1492, the native populations were down 90%. So there was this huge extermination, some of it accidental, some of it on purpose, purposeful extermination of native people in the Americas, up to 90% of them within a few generations of 1492. So by the 1700s, the demographers have said that only, maybe 5-6 million people throughout all of the Americas were indigenous by the early 1700s. It's really crazy. And how did this happen? Okay, next slide. Okay, and this is just, about the Renaissance, which we're, feeling positive about. And next slide. So how did we get here? Right around 1492, there was a period of intense and perpetual European warfare in Europe. And all of that bloodshed and all of those conquests and all of that warfare and fighting was brought here. It was part of what was going on in 1492. It was going on all over Europe, and that warfare was spread to North and South America with a vengeance. So the warfare that was brought here wasn't brought here by accident. It was historically in context what was happening there. Next slide. It was also a time of intense European religious persecution. 1492 was the year of the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition against the Jews, and then later against the Muslim people who lived in Spain and Portugal. And the Inquisition, in fact, was brought to the Americas by the Spanish and Portuguese. And that same religious fervor that their European religion was the only true religion was taken out on the native people who had 10,000 years, 12,000, 14,000 years of spiritual development of their own religious practices. So some of the eradication and the forced assimilation that was going on by the colonizers was not an accident, because it was what was going on in Europe, and it was brought here. That same kind of persecution was brought here. The native people were thought to be pagan. They were thought to be idol worshippers, nature worshippers, and they either had to be converted or eradicated to a great degree. It's a very sad story. We've heard of it, but it's my job to revisit it so we can get to where we are today. Next slide, please. And probably on top of everything else were the epidemics. And this slide is actually a print of something that a native Mexican Indian did, probably an Aztec did, right around the time of the Spanish conquistadors in Mexico, and about the smallpox epidemic. So most of the native people who perished didn't die of warfare necessarily, or forced conversion or assimilation. They died of these horrible diseases brought from Europe that they had, no tolerance of whatsoever. And we know that this is a fact. One of the excavations that I worked on was in Connecticut. It was it was an excavation of the Tungus Indians in the Connecticut River Valley. Turns out that the Tungus Indians were a very vibrant non-Lenape tribe. However, they faced the same pressures that all the native people did in the Northeast, and they were all killed and died from a smallpox epidemic in the late 1600s. And that was part of the legacy, when I went on this dig years ago, that we learned about what happened to the Tungus Indians. Literally the last Tungus person died of smallpox, like in the 1690s. So it's a sad history. I'm not going to be morbid in this talk, but we need to know what's going on and what happened, and refreshed thinking about that. Next slide. And here we go. In my thinking, there's a lot of talk about what the original sin is, using a biblical phrase, what the original sin is of the Americas. And it's, some people say the original sin is African slavery. The fact is that Africans were only brought to America when the native population and the native labor force, which had been enslaved in many places, especially the Caribbean, were destroyed. When the populations of like Hispaniola had like 95% of all native people killed either by the epidemics or in slavery, then they had to ship black people over here. So the original sin, if you want to look at the word original, the original sin of colonization is the Indian slavery. And once the native people were exploited to the point of eradication, then black people, to their great misfortune, were brought here. And this is a cut, this is a print showing the native people digging mines in South America. That is what that print is. Those are caves, those are mines in the background, and you can see how they're pouring out the dirt in the front, looking for gold or silver, whatever. So we'll go to the next slide. And then what was happening in Europe was that there was a technological revolution going on. And one of the things of the technological revolution going on in the 1400s is the advancement of boats and ships that could now sail the seven seas, where previously they couldn't do that. Of course, the Europeans also had gunpowder and military hardware. So those kinds of things also facilitated colonization in the New World, the European advances going on at the same time. This is a drawing depicting Henry Hudson sailing into Lenapehoking, Lower New York Bay in 1609. And in fact, this painting, I should have had who was the painter, but it was done 200 years after the fact, in the 1800s. Of course, that just gives you an idea. It's an idealization of that important moment. Okay, next slide, please. So going back to 14,000 BP, before the present, people in the Northeast lived in longhouses. They lived very close to nature. They were part of nature in a way, and they were certainly advanced, 100% human people, and they had very advanced cultures where they lived, to some degree in great bounty. In fact, when Henry Hudson showed up in 1609, one of the things he wrote in his diary was that the people he met in Lenape-Hoking were the healthiest people he ever saw in his life, healthier than any Europeans he had ever met. And this was already his third of 4 voyages. So he'd been around. These were the healthiest people that he ever saw. So, not to romanticize it too much, but this is a depiction of what, native life might have looked like in Lenape-Hoking. So next slide, please. So the native people who lived here, including the Wappinger Indians who lived by Beacon, and the Esopus people who lived in and around Kingston area, and the Munsee people, and so many hundreds and hundreds of communities lived in the land of Lenape-Hoking. And that land stretched from the Catskills to lower Delaware and Chesapeake Bay, from eastern Pennsylvania all the way into central Connecticut, central Long Island. So it was really a very large territory that was part of Lenape-Hoking. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So one of the things that has spurred me on lately about Lenape people is where I live, every other town and every other stream and every other school has a native name, and yet I would meet people who said, "Oh, aren't they extinct? There's none of them anymore. They're gone. They're like erased." And I'm like, no, this is not true. Let's deal with reality for a second. Lenape, Delaware people are a living, thriving people, and they are among us. And go to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit more about them. And just on a broader scale, so the most recent census information for the United States had 6.8 million people self-identified as American Indian or Alaska Native. 6.8 million. And just to go down to the blue part of it, so they didn't have the word Lenape in the 2010 census. They used the word Delaware as Delaware Indian. That's the European name for the Lenape people, named after Lord de la Warr, who was one of the colonizers. And he attached his name to the river where many of them lived. That's how they got the name Delaware. So in the 2010 census, there was this identification, and that's just numbers of population in the United States. How many people self-identified as Delaware, Lenape. And those are the numbers. Many Native people are mixed between 2 tribes of ancestry. Some of them are mixed with white, and that's ancestry with 1 non-tribal race, and et cetera, et cetera. The total number was over 18,000 Lenape, Delaware people living in the United States. And then in Canada, there are over 2,300 people living as Lenape, Delaware First Nation people. Where do most of them live? They live mostly in Oklahoma. They live in Wisconsin. And then there are some Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and again in Canada. So you may be thinking, how the heck did they get to Oklahoma and Wisconsin? Well, that's part of the story of the forced migration. So next slide. And this is a map that shows the forced migrations. And the forced migrations happened as a result of colonization, forced assimilation, conversion, warfare, slavery. There were a number of wars that were fought in this area. One of them was not directly with the Lenape, it was the Pequot Wars. You might have heard of them, the Pequot Wars of the 1600s. And when the Pequots were almost destroyed, many of them were sold into slavery by the English to their Caribbean colonies. The same thing happened to the Lenape people, the Esopus, who lived right around Kingston. When they were defeated in the Esopus Wars, also in the 1600s, many of the captive Lenape Esopus people were sold to slavery in the Dutch islands in the Caribbean. So they were escaping all of the heavy-handedness and horrors that were going on here, the atrocities. So they started moving. Some of them moved north and went to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where they became called the Stockbridge Indians. And then there was a horrible massacre there, so they had to leave, even though most of them had been converted to Christian, but they still had to leave. And many of the Lenape, Delaware people joined their former enemies. That's how pressured they were. They joined the Haudenosaunee people, which we know as Iroquois. They joined the Mohicans, who from time to time were enemies of the Esopus and Wappinger people. They joined their enemies because the other native people welcomed the refugees who were escaping from Lenapehoking. And gradually, some of them made it to Canada, some of them made it to Wisconsin, and then they had this long, horrible trail taking them all the way down south, through Arkansas, through Texas, where they were thrown out. They were not allowed, no Indians were allowed to live in Texas. They were thrown out, and they were forced to move to Indian Territory, which we know as Oklahoma, and that's how they ended up where they ended up. So next slide, please. So today, there are 3 federally recognized Lenape, Delaware tribes. One of them is called the Delaware Nation, and they are in Anadarko, Oklahoma. Another one is called the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and Caney, Kansas. So those are 2 of the 3 federally recognized Lenape, Delaware tribes nowadays. Next slide. Then there's the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican Nation, where the Lenape Munsee people from this very area moved in with the Mohicans, their former enemy, and then in Stockbridge, and then they had to flee from there. They ended up in Bowler, Wisconsin, on a reservation. There are also First Nation Canadian recognized Lenape communities. There are 3 of them. You can see them there. And there are also 4 United States state recognized Lenape, Delaware communities. They're not federally recognized, they're state recognized, and that's an administrative distinction of great importance in Indian country. You know, it's worthy of a whole other, you know, talk. But so those are the recognized Native American Lenape, Delaware populations, First Nation in Canada and the United States nowadays. And again, the point of this is they're still here. They were not erased, and they're thriving in their communities, and you know, they want to have a new presence among us again. because you see that there's none of them in New York. There's no state recognized Lenape, Delaware people in New York. There's no reservation in New York. There's no land base for Lenape people yet in New York. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the second part of the presentation, which is some new research. And what prompted me to think about this is one of the themes that have been beaten into everybody's head, unfortunately, over the years, is that the Native people were primitive. That they, and when they're primitive, when you consider them as quote unquote primitive, they're unworthy of respect. They're unworthy of dignity. You don't have to listen to them. You could just push them to the margins. You could push them to the side. You could, tell them to get out of town, basically. And so one of the pieces of research that's been happening is an understanding and an uncovering of the vast trade networks that were going on in 1491. And this is just a schematic. It's just a generalization of some of the trade networks that were going on. So what was being traded? Well, one of the things that was being traded was salt. There was a big salt trade because salt is an important commodity for human life. Another commodity that was traded, especially early on, was copper. It was one of the few metals that were being used in North America. There was a copper trade. There was also a trade in pipestone so that Native people could, smoke tobacco and other kinnikinnick, other kinds of plants to smoke. So they used certain kinds of pipestone to make their pipes. There was also a trade from Central America and Mexico of feathers that were sent here. Exotic bird feathers were sent all the way up north. And on those same trade routes came corn and came tobacco and other important food stuff that were sent around. So the Native American people were not primitive people. They had extensive, important, and documented trade routes, which have to be acknowledged and respected. And we go to the Native people now to find out information from them about their trade routes and about their the cultural assimilation and sharing between different communities and tribes. Okay, next slide. Okay, so talk about new research. So very recently in Mexico, this city of 20,000 people has been excavated, and there was a realization by the archaeologists with the help of Native people in that area that this city of Izapa in Chiapas, Mexico, was a planned city. So this was, the Native Americans and indigenous people did not just live in these rude little settlements and, with nothing but a loincloth. I mean, we have to get those kind of ideas out of our head if at all possible. This is an example of a city that was planned probably 600 years before London existed. And this is a picture, a photograph recently taken of the plaza of this city. So, they had a city of 20,000 people. And there were many cities right around Izapa that were also planned with obviously city planners doing this. And they had to take all the measurements and, architects and laborers, etc. So, it's an eye-opener to hear about that kind of research that's going on with the help of Native people. Next slide. and talk about sophistication. You know, we hear stereotypes about the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayas. Well, this jumped out at me because this is one of the few papers, one of the few texts that the Spaniards didn't destroy, that somehow was hidden away and saved and sent to Madrid, and some anthropologists found it. And what it is a tax record. It's a page showing the kinds of tribute that different cities and towns were paying to the Aztec capital before the conquistadors destroyed Tenochtitlan, the capital city of Mexico. So they had a very sophisticated political system. It wasn't just people running around in loincloths over there. So this is another thing that we have to acknowledge, that Mesoamerica was part of Native America. Mesoamerica was part of indigenous America. It wasn't something different. It was actually a part of it. They had a numerical system. They had writing. They had an advanced calendar. They had astronomy. And these things have to be acknowledged and, considered when we're thinking of Native America. I love that graphic. Okay, next, please. Okay, so now we're talking about Etzanoa. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Etzanoa. Well, it turns out that Etzanoa is in Kansas. There's a little map there, Arkansas City, Kansas. And what's there? Well, there's not much there now, but it was once a city of 20,000 people before the Spanish got there. Now, we know that in North America, okay, we have the Pueblos, but other than the Pueblos, we never hear about native people living in actual cities. This was a city that the Spanish reported when they attacked it, that had 20,000 people living in there. And we didn't know about it until recently, when some scholars went to, again, Madrid, found these papers talking about this place, Etzanoa, and then they started having archaeological digs there to verify that many people had lived there. Those people, in fact, are the ancestors of the Wichita Nation of Native Americans who live in Kansas and Oklahoma to this day. And they helped inform the archaeologists who were digging Etzanoa. And that dig's been going on 3-4 years. I think it's the University of Arkansas, and hopefully we'll hear more about it because it's amazing. But most people don't know about it. It's been erased, and that's what we don't want. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we're going to get to an area of great discussion and debate, and that's the Indian land deeds. And among the Indian land deeds is this couple of pieces of paper called the Rombout Patent. The Rombout Patent was a series of transactions, 1683 to 1685, between the British colonizers and the Wappinger Indians right around Beacon and right in Dutchess County, where the Native Americans essentially sold 85,000 acres, which is 1/7 of modern Dutchess County, to the English colonizers for maybe $1,200-$1,500 worth of stuff. So the question is, did the Native American people get snookered? Did the Native American people get robbed of their land? And this is an issue of great debate, because if you have a Eurocentric view that the native people were primitive, that they didn't understand what land was, they didn't understand real estate, they didn't understand transactions, and they were just selling all their land for beads. That's one point of view. There's another point of view that I wanted to, bring to folks' attention today, based on some new research, and some of this research has been informed by modern native people talking about this. And again, the question is, did the native people get swindled? Well, just to go back a step, one of the reasons that the colonizers came here was to make money, and the fur trade. And very early on, the Dutch and the English saw the bounty of the North American forests in terms of the fur-bearing animals. The fur trade lasted for about 50 years until most of the animals were shot out, and the fur trade crashed. Didn't exist anymore after really 1700 in this area, less than 100 years for sure. And then another trade that was happening at the same time was the wampum economy, where certain native people who had a value on shells on Long Island, the seashells, were using wampum as a trade barter. And eventually the colonizers got involved in this. They got involved in the wampum economy, and that eventually crashed as well. For a while, wampum was legal tender in the colonies. If you had wampum, you could pay the grocer or the dairyman, or, for anybody, and it was considered money. But eventually the wampum economy crashed. One of the reasons it crashed was that it was counterfeited by English unscrupulous traders who were dyeing wampum so that it would be, look like it had more value than it had. And eventually so much junk wampum was in the market that the whole wampum market crashed. So what did this leave the native people with? They didn't have fur-bearing animals. They didn't have use of the wampum economy anymore. The only things they had was their labor and their land. And that was worth a lot to the European colonizers, so that over the generations, the native people were forced to sell their lands because they had nothing else. They couldn't just go out and hunt for fur-bearing animals and then, trade that. So they only had their labor, and they were used as laborers, and their land to sell. So we know, and this is a photostat, a picture of one of the land deeds from Ulster County, and it's just one of the many. I think there are like 40, 50 different Indian deeds, as they're called, with the Dutch, and many hundreds with the English in New England and Long Island and other places, where gradually the native people sold off their land piecemeal, because gradually they were figuring out what land was worth, and they were figuring out, better terms. The early land deeds, interestingly enough, were more equitable, because the colonizers early on needed the native people's help and assistance, and even military assistance, where they were basically used as allies in these different colonial wars that were going on. But gradually, the colonizers didn't need the native people as much, but the native people were definitely catching on to what all of this writing meant and what it did mean for them. It was one of the things about it is that when the native people sold things, sold land rather, when they sold land, they were getting things that were of value to them. We say, oh, they were selling all this thousands of acres for a couple of $1,000s worth of stuff. That stuff for them was really valuable. They were getting things that they never had before. They were getting metal tools and axes. They were getting guns. They were getting cloth, European wool cloth, and things that were of great value to them and also had great beauty for them, things that they were unfamiliar with, even things like glass and mirrors. Thank you. So there are a lot of there was a lot of value that they were getting, and also it's important to understand that the native people were understanding that they were being pressured, and they had to have selling land as a survival technique because they almost had nothing else to trade to get into the colonial economy. Once the beaver trade went and the wampum economy died, they had nothing else except their land and their labor. So they had to get into and they were gradually getting into the European money economy. And the only way to get into that is to gradually sell the land. So they weren't, getting robbed as much as we think they were. They actually, on a certain level, certainly knew what they were doing. There's another aspect of it that I wanted to mention briefly, and that is that native people were communal. They had leaders, and the names of the people that you see in this deed right here, and their symbols represent the sachems, the sachem, the leadership of the native communities that were assigned and given permission to sell the land communally. So it's not like they didn't understand the concept of land ownership. It's just that the land was owned communally. They understood that. Native people definitely understood that they had certain lands for hunting, certain lands for example, on Long Island, clamshell gathering, certain lands that were their garden crops, and that those lands belonged to either the community or a clan or a family, maybe not an individual, but they definitely had an understanding. Their lands may not have had hard boundaries, but there was a general understanding in every community that land was controlled by either a family, a clan, or the community in general, and it could be passed down. And we know that this is the case because in many documents, the native people indicated that this was so-and-so's land because it was his father's land or the clan's land. And in fact, they even went to court. There are many cases of native people going to the colonial courts and asking for redress because the land was, being traded unfairly, or their descendants weren't going to get a piece of the land as had been promised. So the native people were not primitive. They understood land ownership. It's just that the ownership was communal. It wasn't individual. They didn't have hard boundaries. They certainly, after a short period of time, understood that putting down their name on a piece of paper meant a lot. And maybe it was something that was unfamiliar in their home culture, but they got it pretty quickly. They understood that. just a quick other point. Another reason, and you can go to the next slide, which is more of the same. Another thing that's a factor here is, so why did the Dutch and why did the English bother to write all this down if they were just stealing the land? If you're just going to take the land and, give such a disproportionate unequal amount, then why bother, writing a piece of paper to the victim and saying, hey, you're getting ripped off, we'll memorialize this. Well, it turns out that most of the deeds, the reason for most of the deeds was not to satisfy the native people. It was actually to satisfy the royal leadership or the company leadership back in Amsterdam for the Dutch, and the royal leadership in England and the royal governors, because they wanted pieces of paper to prove that they had legitimate real estate land deeds against one another. So the Dutch definitely had rules not to rip off the Indians, and they also had rules that they had to have written deeds to prove land ownership against English claims. And the English had to have deeds to prove any kind of usurpation by the Dutch who might want to encroach on their land. So one of the foundations of these Indian land deeds was actually a colonial issue, not so much an Indian land deed. Okay, so now we get to the last part, and thank everybody who's still on for their patience. So talking about land, we're going to listen to Indian country now, and some of their issues are what I bulleted. And the first is sovereignty and land repatriation, based on the fact that over the centuries, so much of their land has disappeared, and they were forced into these reservations basically on the worst available land. And the issue of sovereignty means that they want to be considered a nation equal to the United States government, that they have their own government. And in fact, that is in the Constitution, that Native people are sovereign. And that means that they have their own governing body and their own laws and their own land. So that's the first bullet point. The second bullet point is the rematriation. I like that word, rematriation of their sacred objects. And we'll talk about each of these quickly. And then the third is the fighting the appropriation that's been going on and restoring cultural identity in essence. And then the last is the land acknowledgement statements and exactly what that's all about. Okay, so next slide. So this is June 2021. Well, in May, which was all of 9 days ago, some land was purchased by an Open Space Institute, and it had been a nature preserve just outside of Albany. And it was returned to the Stockbridge, Muncie, Mohican people. It's not going to be a reservation, but it is going to be monitored by the native people of that tribe, whose base is in Wisconsin. And they do have an office in Troy, New York. So this is an example of land returning to native people right here on the Hudson River. So I'm hoping that some of us might be able to visit this trail one day. I heard there's good bird watching there, etc. Okay, so that's just an example. Now these kind of land returns are happening all over the country. They're happening heavy in Alaska and in California and in the state of Washington. An island was just returned. That's just off the coast of Washington state. And there's all kinds of information. So that's what's going on right there. So next slide. So this is the second piece of it. So in 1990, the United States government finally had the consciousness to create the Federal Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And what this says is that human remains, sacred objects, the remains of ancestors, unassociated objects, etc., cultural objects that are in institutions, museums, colleges, all kinds of institutions need, and private collections if possible, need to be returned to the Native American nation that is associated with those kinds of objects. And the objects that are on that screen there on the left-hand side, those are plundered from the graves of indigenous Alaskans. And they were in the Ethnological Museum of Berlin for 100 years. They've finally been returned home. This is a really important issue in Indian country. That these objects, these objects be returned and respected to their rightful tribe and community whenever possible. This is a big part of listening to Native America, because they are demanding the return of these objects that were plundered or sold. And, they're in museums and all kinds of basements, collections all over the country and all over the world. This is a really important part, because again, these objects are living things. This is part of the presence. This is not just, an archaeological relic, an arrowhead. And even if it was, it's a presence. And the presence has energy, and it has a spirit, and it has a force, and it needs to be returned to the rightful people who can honor it correctly. This is a big thing, and the Native people are helping the non-Native community in understanding this. Okay, next slide. Do you know anybody who looks like that? I don't. This is an example of, a Native American mascot, a college mascot. And this is part of what Native people call appropriation, the misguided, negative appropriation of Native symbolism and culture and all kinds of elements of indigenous life that have been appropriated to consumer products, school names, and sports teams. And it also contributes to the erasure of Native Americans as real people, because this is a caricature. This is a stereotype. This is a reflection of bigotry, showing a Native person as a savage like this. Okay, next slide. So I'm not going to get into the whole story here, but there was this Little League that had the erstwhile Chief Wahoo as the symbol for the Little League. And it took 2 years for the Little League to come around, not only this Little League, but the entire Little League organization representing 1 million kids around the world, because Little League is international. And Little League International has banned the use of Native American stereotypes and ethnic stereotypes from any team around the world. And this is following the NCAA, the college championships, banning that, and hundreds of schools around the country and Canada banning these kinds of negative stereotyped images. Last week, the state of Nevada banned all Native American negative stereotypes and images from sports teams and school names in that state. Maybe New York one day will have that kind of illumination and be able to do that. So this is a really important part of listening to Native people. They don't want to be on box tops and cereals and sports teams, and certainly not without their permission. So this is an important kind of an issue. Okay, next. And just last week, you may have seen this, but in British Columbia was discovered a mass grave of a few hundred children who were buried without their parents' knowledge that they had died at this residential school in British Columbia. And the residential schools were set up in Canada and in the United States, like the famous or infamous Carlisle School, where Jim Thorpe was sent. These schools were to accommodate forced assimilation and conversion. They were all run by religious organizations, European-based religious organizations, all through Canada. And what happened was the children were taken forcibly from the Native American families, sent to these schools, sometimes as young as 4 years old. They didn't get out until they were 18, 19, 20. Many children never returned. We know, according to the modern country of Canada, in the early 2000s, there was an apology made by the government of Canada to the First Nations for all the abuses, sexual abuses, etc., forced assimilation of the Native people who were sent to these schools. And only in the 1960s were these schools finally disbanded. The finding of this mass grave is an example of an atrocity, really. And those graves and other graves that are being found at these schools, those are the ancestors. Those are relatives. And this is criminal. And there's quite an upheaval going on in Canada, and there's some stirrings in the United States as well. Most of the residential schools in the United States were out west. There were none, to my knowledge, in the East. I'm just not aware of that. Maybe there's research to be done, but most of these schools were out west. But they were throughout Canada, from east to west. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. And this is that school, the Kamloops Indian Residential School, British Columbia. It's a very, very sad part of colonial Western history. Can't be denied. We have to deal with it because we have to, face the truth, even if it's hard. And then that's the only way we can move on together. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is a photo taken last week of a vigil in Calgary, honoring the Native kids who died at that school, and the parents were never told. It's an unmarked mass grave. It's terrible. So we'll leave that. We'll go to the next slide. And one thing that's going on right now with Native America that's really important, it's something I think it's kind of new. And these are these land acknowledgement statements. A land acknowledgement statement is really a statement of reconciliation. It's meant to be an action statement. It's not meant to be a welcome statement or a mission statement that somebody wrote and nobody ever looks at. It's supposed to be, land acknowledgement statements are supposed to be collaborations between the person or the organization that wants to have such a statement and the Native people who live here or lived here, and that in a way is a concessionary statement. A concessionary statement reflecting the fact that some wrongs have been done and that we're aware of it, and the non-native population wants to reach out and begin actively correcting a historic wrong that has been done, and that we're going to basically get up and do something and address some of these wrongs. And that's the basis of it as I understand it. We'll go to the next slide. And this I took from a place called the Native Governance Center in Minneapolis, and this is on their website. It's public information. And basically, the suggestions are, in creating a land acknowledgement statement, and I took it from some of this from other sources as well, is that you're acknowledging that the land that you're on, let's say it's the Beacon Historical Society, or it's the Hudson River Maritime Museum, or whatever. The land that they're on is living. It's part of who we are, and it reflects our histories. And some of it are our native histories. And that we have to listen to that presence. And it's also about respect, acknowledging the ancestral connection, spiritual connection to the land, using the correct language, using the correct words, the correct native names. And it acknowledges that the native people are still here and are vibrant, thriving, despite all of the negative stuff that we've had to catalog today. But it's also a commitment of agency and action to support and actually connect with Native people and Native community. They don't, a land acknowledgement statement is not just a statement, for statement's sake. It's a statement of commitment, like to really help out and do something, to build an authentic relationship with Native people, to leave them stronger and, more part of the world community. And basically, we're here on this earth together. We have to face these difficult truths. We have to enter the future together with mutual respect and celebration. This is part of creating this statement. And then finally, the land acknowledgement statements are action verbs. Like I said, they're not, mission or welcome statements that nobody ever looks at again. And they require self-reflection and some hard work. It's not easy to put one of these together thoughtfully and meaningfully, that it means something to the person or people who create it, but it also means something to the Native people that hear it and are approached with it. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. So with that thought, and it's been a lot, I hope some of you are still with us. We're going to take some Q&A, and I hope I brought us up to date a little bit about what's going on in Indian country, what's important to Native people, what's important to me and to us, I hope. And, Wanishi, which means thank you. And if you have any questions, just feed them to Diane through chat right now. And, I'll if I can, I will try to respond.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good.
Yes.
Harv, that was really amazing. It was extremely comprehensive, and you laid out a clear and concise, complicated story that embraced so many different aspects of our history and, what we can do to further understand our place in it and what we can do in the future. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, I'm just going to look in the chat right now, and then if somebody has a question, can they just shout out the question, please? I see that I'm looking over here from Stephanie Stockbridge Muncie. She adds some interesting resources for listening directly to Indigenous thinkers and activists. So if you look on the chat, you can cut and paste. There's a guerrilla history. There's the rednation.org, allmyrelationspodcast.com. Oh, some great podcasts. Indigenousaction.org/podcast. So please check on this on the chat box. There's some great resources there.
Thank you, Stephanie. There's also, if you want to follow some news, there's Indian Country Today. It's a website, but it's a news website. Every single day they have, 10, 20 stories that are relevant to Indian Country Today. It's really good.
Okay, a question from Anna. When the Lenape were forced to migrate to Oklahoma, did they join forces with other tribes that they encountered there?
The answer to that is yes. They joined forces in a sense, but not favorable to them, because what happened was when Native people were pressed, especially in Oklahoma, to be on some land, there were all kinds of cross claims. And in fact, in Oklahoma, one of the things that happened to the Lenape Delaware people was that to a certain level, they were forced to move in with the Cherokee people, who were much more populous. And up until 10 years ago, there were lawsuits between the Lenape Delaware people and the Cherokee, because the Lenape Delaware people wanted to be separate from the Cherokee, have their own governance, their own nation, their own part of territory, etc. So they joined forces, but not at least not there, not in Oklahoma, not necessarily for them in a positive way. It's a very complex situation. In other places, like with the Mohicans and even the Haudenosaunee Iroquois, the Lenape Delaware people did join forces in a positive way. So that was good that they were taken in by them when they were fleeing and they were refugees.
Okay, thank you. Taryn asks, what has been the sentiment in the professional sports leagues about changing Native names? I often see a study referenced stating that Native Americans are supportive, but I question that.
Well, I can tell you that the Cleveland Indians earlier this week said that they were changing their name, finally. They changed their logo last year, I think, or 2 years ago. They finally got rid of and retired Chief Wahoo, but they're changing their name now. Most Native people who have any kind of consciousness do not want to have their name as a mascot, their tribal name or any aspect. The National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, which is the oldest Native American organization in the country, is absolutely against mascots being used, Native mascots. And in fact, they were very helpful in getting the Little Leagues and other entities, the lacrosse leagues, for example, to get rid of all kinds of stereotypical Native names. So I think most people, most Native people, and anybody with a consciousness does not want those kind of names.
Okay, thank you. Gary would like to know, on the map with the green section, what are the words in white font versus the dark font?
I don't have that up right in front of me, but I can tell you that
Here, I can put it up.
we can find it.
I'm going to try. But no,
The Lenape people had what European scholars considered 3 dialects of their language. 3 dialects. Okay. The lighter green is considered Muncie dialect. The center is sometimes called Unami, or it's more like central Lenape. The southern has been called Unalashtigo, which is the southern Lenape dialect. It's almost like, people in England can speak American. We can speak British. We can understand them. We're 2 different dialects. Well, the Lenape, think of what a distance that is from the Catskills to the Chesapeake and Delaware Bay. So over the centuries, different dialects evolved. That's what those colors are about. Thank you, Diane, for getting that slide up.
Okay, Rocco noted, I was only recently apprised of the significant role of the Quechuan rifle, Jack Peterson, in what resulted in the discovery of Arnold's treason. This should be in history books. He is buried here in Croton-on-Hudson.
A lot of Native people and a lot of Native stories have been erased. And another story is of the Wappinger Native people who fought on the side of the Americans in the Revolution, and that's been erased. The very first treaty between the United States government and any Indian nation was between the United States Army and the Lenape Delaware people. And that was during the Revolutionary War, the very first treaty. You have to go digging to find that fact. And it was the first treaty between our government and a Native people. So a lot's been, forgotten, but we're trying to remember it and honor it and talk about it.
Can you talk about the Native Americans that you learned about that lived at Mount Julian and possibly in the in the Rombout Patent in our area?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess it was about 20 years ago, and there was what's called survey archaeology done at Mount Julian historic site in Beacon, which is right on the river. and an archaeologist did some survey archaeology, which means that it wasn't an intensive dig, but they were just trying to find, if there were any kind of surface objects and what things were around that they could easily find. And sure enough, native people who were the ancestors of the Wappinger people, evidence was found that they were there. It's very likely that at Mount Julian and all along the banks of the Hudson River, the native people had seasonal camps. They probably didn't live there all year long, but they had seasonal camps where they would fish and hunt and gather, the fruits and nuts that were around, and then go back to their main settlements, which would be further inland. So that's what was found at Mount Julian. Thank you for reminding me about that. In a lot of places, in fact, I was part of a dig, an excavation at Bard College, probably 25 years ago. And again, it was on one of the bluffs looking over the river. The native people were smart enough not to be right on the river, because guess what happens? You get flooded, and they figured that one out. So what they did was they would move on, have their settlement or their seasonal camps on top of the bluff, which wouldn't get, inundated by a flood or a freshet in the spring. And that's where we found evidence of native habitation. And you'll find that people have found that, all on the hills overlooking any kind of water, body of water, that kind of a thing. That's where the native people around here live. The Esopus Indians have that name because the word, Esopi, it means river in Lenape. And that's how we got the word, Esopus Indians, because they were living on all of the hills surrounding all the many creeks in Ulster County.
So, Harv, what happened to the artifacts that were found on the digs?
I don't know, but my guess would be that whatever institution that archaeologist worked with took that stuff back and cataloged it, and it's probably sitting there. As far as I know, he didn't come across any kind of burials, thank goodness, or funerary sacred objects. What we find a lot of is, pieces of rock that were used to make, points, arrowheads, spearheads, things like that. Firecracked rock, where they had their encampments, and you'll find evidence of fish hooks and weights, which were used for nets, and scrapers that were used to scrape the hides, and awls and axes and things like that were used to take trees down and make canoes and those kinds of artifacts. They were probably, Elaine Hayes would know, what institution he worked with.
Mm-hmm. Zoe asks if you can share with us who your local Indigenous collaborators have been.
Okay. Well, one of my local Indigenous collaborators has been an organization called Lenape Center. The Lenape Center is located in Manhattan, but they make up a group of people who are Indigenous. They're Lenape people, and they represent the reservations, or they're not representing them. I have to correct myself on that. They were originally from the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican people, and one of the reservations in Oklahoma. And I've had an ongoing conversation with them.
Okay. If people have more questions, oh, does anyone else have any more questions? Oh, here's Rocco. I've encountered mounds thought to be Native American graves in local forests. Is this likely to be so based on your knowledge? They are primarily comprised of stones and cobbles.
It's possible, but don't go near them. Don't touch them. Don't dig them up. Don't be a pot hunter. It's certainly possible. If they lived here 14,000 years, some of them passed away and they got buried. And it's certainly possible. Could be possible that they're piles of rocks that were put there by colonial farmers who were clearing land. There's rock walls and mounds of rocks all over the place like that, where I live. But if you suspect that it's a grave or something like that or a mound, definitely stay away. What you might want to do is, contact some indigenous people if they want to take a look at it. They might know, but a lot of the information to them has been lost as well. So it wouldn't be easy to know something like that, and we don't want to touch them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we're going to end the evening. Before we go, I would like to just mention that Father's Day and graduation's coming up, so you're welcome to join both the Mount Julian Historic Site as a member and the Beacon Historical Society. As a member, you will get a monthly newsletter, which is an informative newsletter on the history of Beacon, and also visit our website at www.beaconhistorical.org. On our shop page, you can purchase our wonderful book, which is a collection of the newsletters by Bob Murphy, as well as other items on the history of Beacon. And this program is being recorded and will be on our website in a few days. And our next program will be Tuesday, July 27th, with Rachel Whitlow, who is the director of the Haverstraw Brick Museum. She'll be discussing the interrelationship between the Haverstraw and Beacon brickyards. So I thank you for joining us this evening, and Harv, thank you so much for your research and sharing it with us. Really appreciate it.
If anybody wants to get in touch with me, can I give you my email address?
Sure. Do you want to do that now, or I can type it right here in the chat? Would that be a good, Harv?
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's Harv, Harv, at Lenape, Hudson Valley, Lenape, Hudson Valley, no spaces.org.
Okay. And you can also reach me at dlapis@beaconhistorical.org, and I can forward you the email to Harv if there's any further questions.
Thank you again, Wanishi. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you so much, Harv. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.